Okay, I think the subject matter of this video is going to rattle quite a few people. All I would ask is that you watch the whole video before commenting so that you know the context in which I'm speaking. And if you disagree with me, that's fine. What I want to discuss is immigration, and specifically about nationality regarding immigration, in relation to immigration. When Donald Trump became president, he of course enacted the legislation that was termed by the media the Muslim ban. Whether it was a Muslim ban or not is a matter of debate. Certainly it was a ban from people coming from certain countries. Now at the time I was quite critical of that, not that I was being PC and that I don't recognise the threat, for example, of pan-Islamist terror, but that it seemed a bit hypocritical when Trump has very much worked to maintain positive ties to Saudi Arabia, which is the birthplace of Wahhabism. So, which is one of the most virulent forms of pan-Islamism. So, is it really a national security thing focusing on pan-Islamist ideology, or is it purely strategic interests? Probably a bit of both. I also know, for example, that a blanket ban, for example, on Iranians would inadvertently affect Iranian Christians who may well be fleeing persecution. So there were a lot of sticking points with that policy. Having said that, I do think that realistically you have to look at the global situation and consider, is a person from country A liable to be the same as person from country B? Now this is controversial because people would say, for example, if we were looking to adopt something like this in the UK, say post-Brexit, I need to look into detail what the government is actually proposing with that, but just as general thoughts of my own, if, for example, we were to have a travel ban from certain countries for certain reasons, there will be those who say, oh well, it's discrimination, you're discriminating against people based on their nationality. And if it was a blanket ban, I would agree with that. My whole life I have been against collective punishment or generalizations of any group of people based on religion or nationality. I think that would be wrong. But I think that you have to also consider just common sense. Let's take, for example, if we look at hostile foreign state like Russia or China. There are quite a number of Russians in London, and there is a lot of Chinese across the UK. Now, I do staunchly believe that the Chinese government is using particularly overseas students as pawns in the game to try and undermine the West. Today, Hua Chunying, the Chinese Foreign Office's spokeswoman, sarcastically said that they look at what's happening in London and Barcelona, they note the protests, kind of saying, oh well, look, you have protests as well, so don't lecture China about Hong Kong. The point here is that China's actually been interfering in the West for years. For all they like to talk about the West interfering in China when we raise human rights concerns, legitimate human rights concerns, and they've no evidence, incidentally, of any interference as a policy matter, as a, espionage sort of situation. But if we were to look at a country like China, and those who are enthusiastic of waving the flag and demanding respect and bullying students from Hong Kong or critical of the CCP regime, they are going to be Chinese students. So that sort of situation that's very specific to a very specific issue, I do think it's legitimate when people are applying to be a student in this country or a business person, whatever it is, to understand what their intentions are. Now, if you've come to the UK as a student, your primary motivation is to be a student. And yes, there's other things that come with that, the social life, taking in culture, etc. And that's all fine. I want our universities to continue attracting support and interests from around the world, including China. But I do think there is ample evidence to see that there is a real problem here. And not only is it a moral problem because, it means other students getting bullied by these brats, and I'm not talking about all the students, I'm talking about those who think that they could behave that way in another country. So that's a moral issue. They are bullying other students. It's also an issue of, frankly, sovereignty. When they behave that way, they are insulting British sovereignty. Now, why shouldn't we be more assertive on that? In fact, one of the biggest problems here is I think we're too damn polite. I've long felt that the British, as a people, particularly looking at our government, is just too polite. Why shouldn't we use the same language the Chinese use? Why shouldn't we demand apologies once in a while? I would really like to see a situation turning in that regard. So, we're not going to scrutinise students from Sweden because of the behaviour of students from China. So that is an example of where you would need to be specific in immigration. And, you're not going to have a situation where, say, enthusiastic groups of Swedes are waving the Swedish flag and demanding that we respect Sweden. It's highly unlikely. That's just an example. Iceland, Sweden, you can name many other countries. No, they're liable to be from China. In some cases you may get it one with freaking the pan-Islamist issue. Now, there are, of course, European converts, but if we're looking at people coming in from a war-ravaged country like Afghanistan or Somalia, and yes, I put on my hands, we are certainly responsible for and culpable for at least a share of the world's problems, in terms of our foreign policy. So I'm not one of these people that says, don't let anyone in. I do think we should help the most vulnerable people, but it makes sense that if people are coming from ultra-conservative Islamic societies, that we scrutinise their views, for example, on so-called honour. For example, do they believe a woman, or a young man for that matter, should they be punished if they dishonour their family? Do they believe in punishing people for insulting the Prophet? These are the sort of questions we need to ask. And as of Chinese students, are you going to come here to study? Are you going to come here to wave around the Chinese flag and impose your nationalism onto another country? So I do think there is scope to look at sources, to look at national origin as part of immigration policy without getting into blanket punishment or blanket bans or anything like that. I'm not for blanket bans. I don't think it's the right way forward, and I think it would inadvertently affect people that A, deserve to be here, and B, we do have a moral obligation to help. For example, Iranian Christians, translators who work for the British Army, and those Chinese nationals who aren't here to serve as pawns for the communist regime. Students who just want to get on with their studies, take in the social life, business people, and tourists. But I think we need to wake up, quite frankly. This isn't about paranoia, this isn't about being jingoistic, it's just about recognising what's happening here. There is ample evidence for it, and as with so many things in this country, the government just waits till the last minute to do anything. We have concerns about this situation. It's just typical British understatement. I would like to see action. I would like to see government ministers in senior positions, Boris Johnson, Dominic Raab, senior figures really, really being vocal on an issue like this. And, I cannot emphasise enough, this is not about xenophobia, and anyone who wants to dismiss my stance that way, they're not paying attention, because I'm being very clear here. I'm not talking about collective punishment, but I am saying that it makes sense to ask those extra questions of Chinese nationals. Will you fly around the Chinese flag? I would even support introducing a law to make it an offence to engage in a demonstration that is hostile to this country. Because freedom of speech and freedom of assembly shouldn't give people the right to violate hospitality. You know, by letting them study here, that's an honour. Yes, they're paying a lot of money, but it's also, you know, a position of privilege that most Chinese will never see. To study in some of the world's top universities, to get qualifications that will improve their lives. So, I really just would like to see us getting a hell of a lot more assertive. When it comes to China, I think we could do a hell of a lot more. I think the May government took assertive measures in its response to the Salisbury attack. I still think I would have liked to see RT banned from these shores, but, you know, can't have everything. I mean, I think that should have happened. But anyway, I give May credit for that. I think she did show resolve. I'd like to see the same sort of resolve with China. Now, as was pointed out earlier on a thread that I was looking at, David Cameron and George Osborne have a lot to answer for. After all, they heralded the Sino-British golden era. You know, they gave China the green light to basically come in, set up Confucius Institutes with pretty much no checks and balances, and the Chinese regime actually applauded George Osborne about 4 or 5 years ago for being an example of a Western diplomat who didn't interfere in China's internal affairs on the grounds that he hadn't been vocal about human rights. So it's basically like, shut up about human rights and we'll be just fine. But that would be selling out to our values. If we're trading with a country, we have a right to ask questions who we're trading with. If you buy a car off someone, you want to know that the salesman is reputable. It's the same principle as far as I'm concerned.